own love of adventure and sport to keep me from coming home again. But I knew that my coat of arms and title would turn every bit of this grumbling into fine admiration. And so it fell out to a greater extent than even I desired, for all the parishes round about united in a sumptuous dinner at the Mother Meldrum Inn, for now that good lady was dead, and her name and face set on a signpost, to which I was invited, so that it was as good as a summons. And if my health was no better next day, it was not from want of good wishes any more than from stint of the liquor. It is needless to say that the real gentry for a long time treated my new honours with contempt and ridicule. But gradually, as they found that I was not such a fool as to claim any equality with them, but went about my farm work, and threw another man at wrestling, and touched my hat to the magistrates, just the same as ever, some gentlemen of the highest blood, of which we think a great deal more than of gold, around our neighbourhood, actually expressed a desire to make my acquaintance. And when, in a manner quite straightforward, and wholly free from bitterness, I thanked them for this, which appeared to me the highest honour yet offered me, but declined to go into their company because it would make me uncomfortable, and themselves as well, in a different way, they did what nearly all Englishmen do when a thing is right and sensible. They shook hands with me, and said that they could not deny but that there was reason in my view of the matter. And although they themselves must be the losers, which was a handsome thing to say, they would wait until I was a little older and more aware of my own value. Now this reminds me how it is that an English gentleman is so far in front of foreign noblemen and princes. I have seen at times a little both of one and of the other, and making more than due allowance for the difficulties of language, and the difference of training upon the whole, the balance is in favour of our people. And this because we have two weights, solid and, even in scale of manners, outweighing all light complacence, to wit, the inborn love of justice and the power of abiding. Yet some people may be surprised that men with any love of justice, whether inborn or otherwise, could continue to abide the arrogance and rapacity and tyranny of the Doones. For now, as the winter passed, the Doones were not keeping themselves at home, as in honour they were bound to do. 20 sheep a week, and 1 fat ox, and 2 stout red deer, for wholesome change of diet, as well as 60 bushels of flour, and 2 hogsheads and a half of cider, and 100 weight of candles, not to mention other things of almost every variety which they got by insisting upon it. Surely these might have sufficed to keep the people in their place, with no outburst of wantonness. Nevertheless, it was not so. They had made complaint about something, too much ewe mutton, I think it was, and in spite of all the pledges given, they had ridden forth and carried away 2 maidens of our neighbourhood. Now these 2 maidens were known, because they had served the beer at an alehouse, and many men who had looked at them over a pint or quart vessel, especially as they were comely girls, thought that it was very hard for them to go in that way, and perhaps themselves unwilling. And their mother, although she had taken some money, which the Doones were always full of, declared that it was a robbery, and though it increased for a while the custom, that must soon fall off again. And who would have her 2 girls now, clever as they were and good? Before we had finished meditating upon this loose outrage, for so I at least would call it, though people accustomed to the law may take a different view of it, we had news of a thing far worse, which turned the hearts of our women sick. This I will tell in most careful language, so as to give offence to none, if skill of words may help it. The following story is strictly true, and true it is that the country people rose to a man at this dastard cruelty, and did what the government failed to do. Mistress Marjorie Badcock, a healthy and upright young woman, with a good rich colour, and one of the finest hen roosts anywhere round our neighbourhood, was nursing her child about 6 of the clock, and looking out for her husband. Now this child was too old to be nursed, as everybody told her, for he could run, say 2 yards alone, and perhaps 4 or 5, by holding to handles. And he had a way of looking round and spreading his legs and laughing, with his brave little body well fetched up, after a desperate journey to the end of the table, which his mother said nothing could equal. Nevertheless, he would come to be nursed, as regular as a clock almost, and, inasmuch as he was the first, both father and mother made much of him, for God only knew whether they could ever compass such another one. Christopher Badcock was a tenant farmer in the parish of Martinhoe, renting some 50 acres of land with a right of common attached to them, and at this particular time, being now the month of February, and fine open weather, he was hard at work ploughing and preparing for spring corn. Therefore his wife was not surprised, although the dusk was falling, that Farmer Christopher should be at work in blind man's holiday, as we call it. But she was surprised, nay astonished, when by the light of the kitchen fire, brightened up for her husband, she saw 6 or 7 great armed men burst into the room upon her, and she screamed so that the maid in the back kitchen heard her, but was afraid to come to help. 2 of the strongest and fiercest men at once seized poor young Marjorie, and though she fought for her child and home, she was but an infant herself in their hands. In spite of tears and shrieks and struggles, they tore the babe from the mother's arms and cast it on the lime ash floor. Then they bore her away to their horses, for by this time she was senseless, and telling the others to sack the house, rode off with their prize to the valley. And from the description of one of those 2, who carried off the poor woman, I knew beyond all doubt that it was Carver Doone himself. The other Doones, being left behind, and grieved perhaps in some respects, set to with a will to scour the house, and to bring away all that was good to eat. And being a little vexed herein, for the Badcocks were not a rich couple, and finding no more than bacon and eggs and cheese, and little items, and nothing to drink but water, in a word, their taste being offended, they came back to the kitchen and stamped, and there was the baby lying. By evil luck this child began to squeal about his mother, having been petted hitherto, and wont to get all he wanted by raising his voice but a little. Now the mark of the floor was upon his head, as the maid, who had stolen to look at him when the rough men were swearing upstairs, gave evidence. And she put a dishcloth under his head, and kissed him, and ran away again. Her name was Honor Josie, and she meant what was right by her master and mistress, but could not help being frightened. And many women have blamed her, as I think unduly, for her mode of forsaking baby so. If it had been her own baby, instinct rather than reason might have had the day with her. But the child, being born of her mistress, she wished him good luck, and left him as the fierce men came downstairs. And being alarmed by their power of language, because they had found no silver, she crept away in a breathless hurry, and afraid how her breath might come back to her, for oftentimes she had hiccups. While this good maid was in the oven by side of back kitchen fireplace, with a faggot of wood drawn over her, and lying so that her own heart beat worse than if she were baking, the men, as I said before, came downstairs and stamped around the baby. "Roland, is the bacon good?" one of them asked, with an oath or 2. "It is too bad of Carver to go off with the only prize, and leave us in a starving cottage, and not enough to eat for 2 of us. Fetch down the staves of the rack, my boy. What was Farmer to have for supper?" "Naught but an onion or 2, and a loaf and a rasher of rusty bacon. These poor devils live so badly, they are not worth robbing." "No game? Then let us have a game of laureate with the baby. It will be the best thing that could befall a lusty infant heretic. Ride a cock-horse to Banbury Cross. Bye-bye, baby bunting. Toss him up, and let me see if my wrist be steady." The cruelty of this man is a thing it makes me sick to speak of. Enough that when the poor baby fell, without attempt at cry or scream, thinking it part of his usual play, when they tossed him up to come down again, the maid in the oven of the back kitchen, not being any door between, heard them say as follows: "If any man ask us who killed thee, say 'twas the Doones of Badgery." Now I think that when we heard this story, and poor Kit Badcock came all around in a sort of half-crazed manner, not looking up at any one but dropping his eyes, and asking whether we thought he had been well treated, and seeming void of regard for life, if this were all the style of it, then having known him a lusty man, and a fine singer in an alehouse, and much inclined to lay down the law, as show a high hand about women, I really think that it moved us more than if he had gone about ranting and raving and vowing revenge upon every one. End of chapter 69. Recording by George Fairchild.